everyone, and welcome to the revived version of The Report, our Monday show every Monday at 7. Going forward, we're reviving our old show. Previously, when I hosted it last year, we were devoted to unbiased, objective news coverage. This year, though, The Report is going to be focusing on political debate on various issues. So again, thank you guys so much for watching. We're so sorry for the technical difficulties that plagued the first run of The Report, but we're happy to be back here tonight. We're going to be discussing 4 issues, and over the course of the whole hour, we'll have those 4 15-minute segments, and we have Eric Cunningham and Nick Morris as our 2 contributors on today, and Nick's going to be providing us with a more liberal perspective, where Eric Cunningham will be giving us a more conservative perspective. I will be moderating for us. So without further ado, we'll get started. First, Eric and Nick, I know the viewers know you from all of our content, but if you could do you have anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, excited to relaunch this. This is one of my favorite shows that we had done from the last year, so I'm really excited to get back into this.
Yeah, it's good to be on. I don't think I've done this before, but yeah, it's great to be on.
Thank you.
I'm excited to get going.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to get started tonight. I'll just give the viewers a nice little rundown on the 4 topics that we have for tonight. So our first topic is going to be about immigration, which has been in the news quite frequently over the last few weeks for a variety of reasons, whether it be in relation to the large mass of immigrants that are now seeking status in the United States, or just the general maintenance of the immigration facilities where many of these migrants, including migrant children, are being held. And there's been a lot of fervor surrounding the conservative-liberal debate, which is obviously more multifaceted than that when dealing with the immigration issue, which is always one of the most politically charged issues that we deal with in the country. Our second topic after that is going to be COVID relief. One of the big hallmarks was the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package proposed by the Democrats. And that was one of the major hallmarks of Biden's first 100 days at this point. So we're going to be discussing COVID relief, whether or not the debt matters in terms of how much debt is accumulated from the appropriation of money to COVID relief bills and how we ought to address COVID relief, etc. Our topic after that will be dealing with vaccination mandates. Just like President Biden said, I believe today, he's opening up the vaccine by May 1st to 90% of adults, and we estimate that near a majority of the American population, and when I say that, I mean around 80%, will have access or either have access or be vaccinated by August this year. So Biden's been touting that as well. And this has led some educational institutions, notably Rutgers University, nearby where I live, to essentially state that all new students and faculty coming back to Rutgers in the fall for in-person education will be required to have both doses of the vaccine, unless we're talking about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which only requires a single dose. And our final topic will be on the filibuster, which has also been a major point of discussion. Generally, the party that is in the minority prefers to have the filibuster because it allows them to some extent, stop the passage of important bills by allowing for continuous debate unless a motion for cloture is filed and then the votes are procured. But now that the Democrats have a functioning majority in the Senate, many Democrats have been pushing to get rid of the filibuster. And the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, and the Republicans are pushing to keep the filibuster. So we're going to be talking a lot about that. And I'm happy to have you guys on again. So why don't we just get right into it with the immigration issue? So my first question for you guys, and by the way, we'll alternate. So we'll start with Eric getting a question and then going over to Nick, and then we'll alternate back and forth. So our first topic is, what is the best way to address the immigration crisis, as some might call it, on the border? And I'll throw it to Eric first.
Yeah, so this is really an interesting dichotomy that we've seen. The Trump administration was obviously pillared throughout most of the last term for its handling of these immigration issues, and specifically along the border. You heard frequent talk of kids in cages, all sorts of things along that line. I think the one element we can say that was unequivocally successful was the stay in Mexico policy, which is that rather than having people go across the border and then wait over here to have their status heard, have them wait over in Mexico as a safe zone so we don't get overwhelmed, and so there's not this crisis on the border. The Biden administration got rid of this policy, I think there wasn't really great reasoning behind it, and now as a result, we're having a major surge of people coming across the border, in all senses of the word. It's really unfortunate what's going on. It's very important because these are areas that are already being hit hard economically. To have the additional spread of COVID that's come in these sorts of conditions, it's also unjust for the migrants who are trying to obviously get across the border and have been falsely led by, whether you think it's by the president or by someone else, that this is the way that they can get into the country. I'm definitely in favor of allowing people in legally. I'm in favor of migration, in favor of refugee status and all that, but we got to do it in a safe manner that ensures that the communities along the border, which are majority Hispanic, are almost uniformly, also ensure that they're safe and protected and don't have to worry about this sort of stuff.
Thank you. And Nick?
Same question.
Yes, just the same, kind of a general introduction to the issue, and try to keep it relatively quick because we have a few more discussion questions on this topic. So,
yeah, okay. So Eric covered the basics of what's going on in the country with regards to immigration. As he said, President Trump had a general policy against immigration, specifically illegal immigration, but also with regards to legal immigration. Now, I can understand this idea that at the moment it's not really the best time to have people coming into the country. It's a burden on some areas, but also thinking about the long term. Thinking about the long term, in terms of jobs, in terms of safety, these are all issues that not just conservatives but populists in general. This is an issue that's been much discussed among both parties over the decades.
okay.
And yeah, they frequently bring up the argument of jobs and of crime. These are issues that with immigration, like not only do they tend to have a minimal effect, they tend to have a positive effect on these issues as a whole. And maybe in the long term, it might have some economic impacts in the negative sense. But as we begin to get out of this pandemic, I think it would be good and healthy for this country, as well as good and healthy for the people coming in, to be letting more of these people in, and really, as Eric said, in the safest way possible. That was an area that I agree with him on, and that is generally where I stand on this issue.
Okay, so you guys basically both gave, relatively good explanations of the different the multifaceted sides of the immigration debate in the United States, whether or not during a pandemic or, the pandemic's unprecedented. Let's start with that. But even if the pandemic weren't an issue today, imagine if we're just talking about, say, the immigration crisis that plagued the 2018 midterm campaign, for example, or fueled much of the rhetoric we saw in the 2016 presidential race. Generally, what you guys are stating are the two parties' general perceptions of the immigration issue. Should we let more people into the country, or should we prevent people from getting into the country? Now, there are different ways of approaching this. In many ways, obviously, if you allow for illegal immigration or create policies that facilitate illegal immigration, then you're going to be letting more people into the country. It's as simple as that. Whereas if you're following the procedures associated with legal immigration, or essentially stricter laws in terms of preventing people from getting over the border and hindering their ability to get into the United States, you're going to be letting in fewer people. But it doesn't necessarily mean you're against immigration. So my second question for you guys goes into what I just said. And this is just a simple yes or no question to the both of you, and then we'll move on. Should immigration in general as a concept in a country be promoted or hindered? Are we better letting in new people and broadening our cultural horizons and our economic horizons? Or are we better keeping the country as it is? Just
yes.
a yes or no from both of you.
I think we should be promoting immigration.
And Eric?
Yeah, I agree. I think it is important that we encourage immigration, especially when done through legal processes.
And can I ask you a clarification question, since you are arguing the more conservative side of our argument tonight on immigration? A lot of conservatives, to some extent, there's a dichotomy between the different conservative stances in immigration. So I know you're arguing that immigration is fine as long as it's balanced, it's maintained, regulated, and it's legal. But there are some other conservatives who tend to be more conservative on this issue, sometimes have more paleo-conservative nationalist leanings with their views on immigration and just oppose immigration altogether. Can you clarify your personal stance on this?
Yeah, I think their perspective generally comes from an idea that immigration is responsible for a decline in jobs. Traditionally, they've also tended to argue negatively terms, or at least that I've perceived it, have tended to argue negatively about Hispanic culture in general. I think, thankfully, since the last election, we've seen a much needed decline in that tendency. Part of it, I think, is a political response to the fact that Donald Trump did improve substantially among Latino communities, among South Florida, South Texas, even Arizona and California. So some of that may be them seeing the the political upside of this, but I think I think my stance is well in line with what other Republicans have long argued. It's certainly not as far out there as Maria Salazar's proposal, which is for legalization and some other things. I think a lot of that stuff is a little bit harder to sell. But just look at the 30 Republicans who crossed over for the labor bill, the farm labor bill. Many of them in agricultural communities along the border or in California in particular. Major crossover support for that. I think the communities that are most impacted by these immigration jobs tend to be more supportive than not. The concern on that side is more practically of safety. Are we letting in the right people across? Are we making sure the people who come over here who are committing crimes and who are over here illegally get sent back? Past administrations have tended to prioritize not doing that. I know personally people who have had their friends and family deported for minor traffic offenses, while actual criminals keep coming over here over and over and over again. That tends to lead to some resentment as well. I think this is a multifaceted issue. Yep. There's a lot of reasons that conservatives and people of all political affiliation make their decisions, but for me, I think it's a moral issue as well as a practical decision of an economy. We wouldn't be the country we are without immigration. I think these communities that want to come over and become part of America do bring something valuable to this country.
Yeah, thank you. And just one final question for you guys, and this is just it's a complex question, so I would ask that you guys keep your answers relatively brief, or at least to one solution. But one of the major issues, and this is not just an issue with the Biden administration, this has been an issue for a long time. And if anything, ironically, we've seen this issue become more exacerbated, yet it's been shown less media coverage under the Biden administration than under the Trump administration. And that is the issue with migrant detention facilities, especially with children in migrant detention facilities. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Trump was harshly attacked for keeping children in cages, as his opponents frequently called it, which prompted his response in the presidential debate to basically say, "Who built the cages, Joe?" which is now famous. But my question to you guys is, instead of the political bickering on this issue, what do you think the best single way is to solve the problems with overcrowded migrant facilities? Because not only are these facilities overcrowded on a given day, most of the residents in these facilities, obviously temporary, are occupying these facilities for way longer than they're supposed to. We're talking about upwards of 72 hours when they should only be there for 24 or 48 hours. So, Nick, do you have a solution?
Well, if you want a very general answer, I would advocate for more humane treatment, and obviously it's more complicated than that. In terms of sorting overcrowding in these facilities, now I'm not personally aware of what sorts of people are kept in these sorts of facilities, but I would advocate for more trust, in a sense, towards immigrants of this nature. Maybe a system in which they become more integrated in local communities and let the courts decide on whatever issues, whatever legal issues there might be in this. As I say, I haven't really read up much on on this issue in particular, but I do have some various thoughts here and there, and that sums it up.
And Eric?
I think it's a little bit above my pay grade. I am not an expert on immigration. This is an issue, in fact, I think relatively recently, I think I've taken more of an interest in. Obviously, humane treatment is important. Part of the problem with these children coming across the border is who is bringing them over. Many times it's smugglers, human trafficking, not necessarily even in a sense, but people are paid to do this. One of the new policies that the Biden administration had is that the families will be sent back, but the children will be allowed to stay for a little bit. I think that may be a reason that we're seeing some of this stuff. Ultimately, I think we do need to treat people humanely. We need to ensure that, especially children, are treated carefully. I don't know if there is one thing that can fix that.
Well, overall, as we transition from this issue to the next one, I agree with parts of what both of you have said tonight. And I think that immigration is certainly always going to be an issue. It's always going to be. It always has been. It always will be. Whether we're talking about the amnesty debates that plagued the Bush Senior administration, or we're talking about the migrant caravan issues that played a role and were politically utilized by the Democrats in their 2018 midterm campaign, which ultimately was successful, we're going to be seeing immigration sticking around for a long time. And I appreciate the insight both of you have provided tonight on that issue. So we're going to be moving on now to our second topic, which is about COVID relief. And as I mentioned earlier, we had a very, very large COVID relief package passed through Congress, which Biden hailed as essentially one of the core aspects of his first 100 days, one of the goals met, if you will. But there were some criticisms from conservatives, and I know Eric will have a lot to say about that, particularly with regards to state tax rates. And essentially the paradigm that was set up between this was basically if you cut state taxes, you're not going to receive the same amount or quality of COVID relief funding for your state. And I guess I'll throw it to Eric first. Eric, what do you have to say about the latest COVID relief package and the effectiveness of COVID relief in general? Is it true? Is it something that's real and beneficial to the constituents, or is it merely a partisan package designed to fuel partisan causes?
Yeah, I think it's well, let's start with the previous packages. We had the CARES Act, and we had the additional act that was passed during the transition of administrations. The original one was a bipartisan bill. The point of it was not necessarily in terms of, I think people are confusing this with a traditional Keynesian stimulus package. That's more intended to increase spending during a recession. The idea is you put money in during a recession that boosts the economy. Conservatives have never agreed with that as an idea, but liberals have since the New Deal. That was basically the idea of the New Deal. The point of the COVID stimulus was that the government was shutting down the economy because of a pandemic. And that while they were shutting it down, they didn't want people to lose their livelihoods because of this partially natural, but also partially government-created a recession. And I think the previous packages were quite effective at that, especially the PPP, small business loans. I think that the stimulus checks were helpful, certainly. The student loan, I know I benefited from the student loan, the waiving of that for a certain period of time. I think that ends sometime later this year. He may extend it again, who knows? I think those were generally effective. I think the most recent package where it differs is that most of it's not focused on COVID relief. It's not focused on that small business benefits. It's more focused on a general broad sense of stimulus. So you got your $1,400 stimulus check, which is nice and all, but you also have a bunch of money going to schools that's not going to be spent for another couple of years. You have money going to state and local governments that don't need it. I think the worst part of it is the section in there, which, whether it was malicious or not, seems to prohibit states who are taking this money from the federal government from lowering their tax rates. I guess it depends on whether or not the court sees this as all money is fungible, or that it's not fungible. Because the idea seems to be that states that are getting this money should not put it back into tax cuts; they should put it into infrastructure. I'm more of the opinion that it should be given to the states to do whatever they want. If they want to cut taxes, great. That's basically what a stimulus check is. If they want to hand out their own checks, they should be free to do that. The fact that this thing passed with no Republican votes, very little Republican input, and was really kind of rushed through with these aspects, the actual vaccine distribution and COVID relief only being a small portion of the bill relative to some of this other stuff like child care benefits and all that sort of stuff, which is worth debating. I don't think this is as effective as a package as the previous ones. And the price tag is definitely concerning. if we keep spending at this rate, we are going to hit inflation. We are going to start. The more money you pump into the economy, the less the value of the money is going to be. It's fairly basic in terms of what that means.
And the
So
whole
long and short of it is, I'm not thrilled by this package, to put it lightly.
And the whole argument, and I agree with you, but if you end up spending this much in the economy, the whole argument that stimulating the economy via government spending, basically how much money can the government throw into the economy, which was, as you said, the hallmark of Keynesian economic policy that was brought to this country during the New Deal era, it arguably doesn't function properly because you're trying to eliminate inflation and promote economic growth, yet all you end up doing is decreasing the value of money and increasing the rates of inflation. And if you're handing money out to the people, there's no work incentive involved, which essentially prevents ultimately it prohibits consumers to some extent from participating in the economy, which will reduce economic growth.
I'm actually this checks are actually the least objectionable part of this bill, in my opinion. I would have been fine if they cut out most of this other stuff and increased it to 2,000. I mean, yeah, I don't like that we're spending that much money, but at least it's going directly to people. When studies have shown of private charity and of government like this, that when you just hand people money, they're generally pretty smart with how they use it. I went out with this stimulus check. I bought a washer and dryer. I would have had to wait a few months to do that. Should I have probably got that money check from the government? Probably not. But if the choice was that or spending a bunch of money on infrastructure projects at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars per job, I'd take the stimulus checks any day. I'd double them any day of the week over that.
Well, part of the reason why they couldn't end up bumping it up to $2,000 is because they had a bunch of other stuff in the bill. I mean, when you look at the relief package, I mean, they were extending supplemental unemployment aid, which is like $300 a week or so to every American that qualifies for it. And they also expanded the tax credit reduction, the child tax credit. So honestly, if the whole point of this bill was to hand money directly to the American people in the greatest quantity, which I don't necessarily agree with as a concept in the first place, they should have just done that. And I agree with what you said there, that if you had streamlined this bill, removed essentially the last part of the bill, which was focusing on giving money to states and local jurisdictions to fund what you said, infrastructure projects, and focused it more on the people themselves, then yeah, I guess I could support that in general.
I think that was basically the Doge thing that was proposed by a representative mayor from Michigan. He proposed basically cutting out most of the stuff and then replacing it with just doubling the direct checks. But I'd like to see what Nick has to say about this as well, get his perspective on it.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if you know, but I am an economics student, and I'm aware that this isn't a typical recession. I mean, you've already touched on this, and really the way that the US is handling this is quite unique in a way. There aren't many other countries who are going about it in quite the same way. I believe the stimulus payments themselves are something that not many countries have done. I certainly haven't got any stimulus check, which I'm a bit salty about, but that's off topic.
Yeah.
I do.
And you got a longer lockdown too. And you got a longer lockdown too.
I do. Yeah. Unfortunately. Yeah, I do disagree with what Harrison said though about how giving the money directly to people. Sorry, I might be misinterpreting your statement, but this is what I heard. That giving money to people is disincentivizing giving back to the economy. And the reason why I disagree with that is because this is sort of a no strings attached payment, if you will. Like it's similar in a way to the UBI, which a lot of people were talking about last year because of Andrew Yang and all that. Yeah, I mean it's a similar concept. You give people money, they aren't going to take that money and say, "Oh, I have this money, I'm not going to work now." It's the opposite. They put that money back into the economy, like Eric said. How you bought a washer and dryer, for instance. That's an economic contribution in a way. And
that was a choice. I could have saved that money, but I'm like, I might as well use it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
My argument is
not
going to spend the money rationally, that it would be more beneficial to the economy if you would reduce tax rates in the first place. They'd end up with more than $2,000 saved in total accumulated paycheck value, which they could then do what Eric did with the stimulus check and insert that into the economy via purchases like purchasing a washer and dryer, for example. I'm not disagreeing with the concept. I just don't agree with the way it's panned out. in the first place, because I believe it to be unnecessary from an economic perspective.
No, fair enough, and that's a debate that you can have on.
But I appreciate again what you clarified. I'm not disagreeing with your general intent. I do agree that it is an economic contribution, and largely what I was trying to say when I was disagreeing with the package itself was not that I was disagreeing with the checks, but just disagreeing with the whole package in its entirety. Because, like Eric said, it could have been more streamlined and more direct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the one thing people can broadly agree upon, which is very interesting, and I'd be interested to hear what Nick thinks about this, is this kind of rise of a UBI sort of thing. I know that's traditionally UBI itself. The concept is more of a liberal progressive concept, although I'd consider Yang more of a neoliberal technocrat than any sort of, by any means, some sort of liberal, or progressive sort of candidate. But on the right, it's also been discussed traditionally as part of the negative income tax. Milton Friedman has talked about cutting or streamlining more, more of these government programs, these welfare programs, and then putting it into a negative income tax where people below an income threshold are given money like a stimulus check rather than paying money into an income tax. I think we've also seen something similar with Senator Romney's child care plan, which would trim some of these welfare programs, but also give a much higher child care benefit. I'm interested to see where this goes, because I think if this recession has done anything, and this virus has done anything, it's caused people to reevaluate some of the previous priors we had on the economy and on the way we're handling, government intervention in the economy and welfare. And I think it's interesting to see where this will go going forward, because I don't think Senator Romney's going to be the last person, or Andrew Yang's going to be the last person to look into modernizing or shifting some of these programs, which really haven't seen a whole lot of change since the Great Society or even the New Deal.
Well, I mean, the idea of UBI, it's not something it's something that I've become warmer and warmer to over the course of the last few years. Generally, the classical approach is that giving money directly to people isn't an efficient use of the money. It's better to spend it on like welfare programs or whatever else the government spends it on. Now, what we're seeing is economists changing their minds on that. They're saying that cash transfers are in fact a good thing, and they do help stimulate the economy. Now, I'm not suggesting that we launch out of nowhere a UBI program like Andrew Yang did of giving all Americans $1,000 a month. We have to actually figure out where that money is going to come from. I think an interesting idea is what Alaska are doing. They've been doing it for about 30, 40 years. And what they do is they use oil revenues, and they put that into a permanent fund, which what that does is it makes a finite resource like oil into an infinite resource, because that money stays there. That it's just the interest that comes out of that goes directly to the people in the form of a dividend. And
that's the fascinating thing with that. I want to mention real quick, because I know we have to shift to another segment, is the conflict in Alaska now is the more moderate Republicans are actually more open to cutting the permanent fund to resolve deficit issues, whereas the conservative Republicans, who some of the moderate Republicans have derisively called the permanent fund a UBI. Some of the more conservative Republicans, like Mike Dunleavy, are opposing any cuts to the permanent fund and want to slash government services instead.
And that would work in a place like Alaska, where you can take the interest off oil revenues and give it to the people as a form of UBI. But what you said earlier about Senator Romney and the idea of having a negative income tax, that's inevitably just going to end up giving back to people who don't contribute as much to the income tax. Considering that the top half of the income stream is what contributes the most amount of raw revenue to the United States income tax. Yet you'd be giving back to people who don't contribute as much.
You would think that, but generally speaking, the negative income tax and Senator Romney's plan, which, to be clear, I'm not a fan of. I do not like his plan. But the idea behind it is to trim existing welfare services or eliminate them, and then to consolidate them into something cheaper that provides greater benefits. That's the idea behind it. That's the idea behind a negative income tax, is you get rid of some of these welfare programs and then you shuffle the savings into something better.
The problem is still there in the first place, that you have these welfare programs that are essentially taking money and giving them money to people who do not contribute to the welfare programs, which is generally the mainstream conservative argument that they've always used against welfare in general. So I don't know. And Senator Romney is just
my view on this is that a UBI or a negative income tax, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, if you think about it, a negative income tax is just a regular income tax plus UBI.
Yeah.
But I think one of the arguments behind it is that if you give a dollar to a rich person, it'll add a certain amount back into the economy. Like, it will add an extra like 70 cents. If you give a dollar to a poor person, it'll give a lot more. I think there was a study on this, and I think the number was about $1.20 or something like that. It was one of the studies that Andrew Yang actually used in his proposal, and that's why he called it a trickle-up system, which is sort of counter to the whole trickle-down economics, which conservatives have been known to use, and rather than looking at who deserves to reap the benefits of a program such as this, we can look purely at the economic benefits to the country as a whole, and yeah, using that argument alone, I think you can find a good argument for UBI or NIT.
And as a conservative, I think the most appealing part of this, and keep on, I'm arguing a little bit of a devil's advocate here. I'm not sold on an NIT or a UBI for sure, but I do think if you're going to explore reforming these systems, which I do think is going to come, the benefit of having a lower spending and providing a higher output would be very appealing to conservatives who may not like the existence of programs in general, but would certainly be open to ways to reduce spending on these programs, especially if it means there's very little that changes in terms of what people gain. Again, I point to the studies on charities, which have found that charities that specifically just give money to people, rather than saying, hey, we're going to buy you a cow, or we're going to, yeah, that's great, but all you get is a cow. It's the give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish, although except in this case, instead of giving you a fish, we'll give you $20 so you can buy whatever you want. If you need a fish or you don't need a fish, you can get something else.
And it's perfectly fine as a concept, but that doesn't
it is
the current welfare system. You can't relate private charity with government-funded welfare programs because they're not the same thing.
Yeah. Well, you can compare the spending behaviors, I think, right? As you can compare how people behave when they're given money, whether it comes from a charity or the government.
The closest we can get to that is if you look at the COVID checks. Because that is raw money just being handed out. It's not, for example, like healthcare benefits that you get if you're over 65 under Medicare or something like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept regardless, and one I'm interested in looking at, even if I'm don't think I'm going to be sold on the exact concept. I am glad we're talking about this instead of just a generic, hey, we'll just throw more money into this program. I think it's a much more interesting debate to talk about something new rather than just throwing into money into programs that haven't changed since the 70s.
Either way, we now have to move on to our next topic, which deals with vaccination requirements. And this is a broad topic, as I mentioned. But I would largely start off, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, with talking about college mandates for vaccinations, both for faculty and for students, incoming students and current students as well, who are coming back to the university, wherever that university might be, for full education in the fall. And since the vaccines will be available to the adult population, meaning 18 and over, by that period of time, what do you guys think about vaccination requirements in that sense? Well, it is true that vaccinations for people of a younger age, particularly students in elementary school and middle school, those under the age of, I think, 10, 15, whatever it is, but basically people under 18, that vaccination will likely not be developed fully until the end of 2021 into 2022. So my question for you is, should there be vaccination requirements for institutions where all the participants are over the age of 18, whether this be a business, whether it be a college, public or private, or whether it be essentially any form, a concert, the ability to fly in an airplane, anything. It's so broad what we could talk about with this issue. So my question to you guys, and I'll throw it to Eric first. What do you think about vaccination mandates in general? And how do you think the issue differs based off of whether we're talking about a private company or university versus a state school that's publicly funded in a way, or gets grants from the publicly funded government?
Yeah, I am broadly supportive of vaccine requirements, especially if it's involving access to schools. Schools, even colleges, require this. When I went to Appalachian State, one of the things that was required was a vaccination history. It's not just for your safety, it's for the safety of others, so they're not exposed to mumps or rubella or anything else along that, like chickenpox even, which is much more painful towards adults than it is towards kids. I never got chickenpox when I was a kid because I had the vaccine. But my dad, who grew up, never had the vaccine as a kid and got it as an adult, and it sucked. It really was not fun. So I'm broadly supportive of the concept of, making sure these vaccines are safe. I've got the Pfizer vaccine. My dad has the Moderna vaccine. He's getting a second shot very soon. My mom got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So we had the vaccine trifecta in the family. My brother got COVID. So basically we got like the quadfecta of all the scenarios of COVID in the family. But the one thing I'm more concerned about is the idea of a vaccine, of a COVID passport. That seems a little bit in contrast to our typical, more liberal ideals of this country, where we've never really required papers. I like the idea of private businesses incentivizing it. The Krispy Kreme idea to give a free donut to every day to anyone who's got a COVID vaccine is awesome. I've yet to take advantage of it because the Krispy Kreme in my town is on the opposite side from where I work. So it's not really a quick drive. But if I had to drive there on the way, you would bet I'd be getting a Krispy Kreme donut every morning. And I would maybe even be getting the vaccine if I hadn't already, just so I could do that. But requiring it for access to travel or to anything else along that line, I'm not sure that's a great idea, and I'm not sure it's necessary. People are getting vaccinated on their own. The vaccines are working, regardless of the chatter online from anti-vaxxers and from nutcases. People are getting them. Rates are going down, and as long as you're masking and social distancing, which these places require anyway, we should be in good shape. So overall, pro-vaccine, pro getting the vaccine, pro mandating it for access to government institutions. I'm more skeptical about this idea of a broad-based societal restriction enforced by the government, though. That seems a little bit more concerning to me.
Mm-hmm. And Nick?
Well, I agree with most of what you said, actually. But yeah, I do think this is a bit of a double-edged sword as an issue. Now, it really depends on what stage of the vaccination process we're talking about. If we're talking about now, you might call this the emergency stage. Not just because the vaccine is approved for emergency use, which in itself sort of makes it adds a certain element of caution into this conversation, because mandating that everyone has a vaccine that isn't really fully approved, it might have some negative connotations. But yeah, in general, I'm personally in favor of either mandating or incentivizing vaccination. But we do have a lot of time to think about it, because we're still in the stage of vaccinating everyone. So yeah, you've got I'm not sure what the number is now, is 60-70% of people who haven't been vaccinated yet. I mean, the vast majority of those aren't not vaccinated because they choose not to be. They're not vaccinated because it's not available to them. I mean, I'd love to get the vaccine now, but I still have to wait a couple of months because I'm not eligible. But yeah, I think because of that, it's definitely not an issue for today. It's more of an issue of 2 months from now. But once it is readily available to everyone, I think incentivizing it and mandating it on a kind of micro basis, like in terms of going to work, or what was the other example you used?
Going to an amusement park
in universities or college campuses.
Yeah, I mean, they can there's other ways that can be incentivized. The private sector offer free tickets to an amusement park if you've gotten the COVID vaccine, or a movie ticket, or all sorts of things. People are already itching to go back to work, and they're itching to go back into enjoying the activities that we enjoyed for years, for our entire lives before the last year. So making sure we have an orderly transition and allow these things to reopen while also ensuring public safety is really important. So I think there's a place for that, to be sure. I know in my state we're starting very soon, getting into the broad vaccine segment. I was able to get mine starting this week. My dad was able to get his a couple weeks ago. When we get to the point where everyone is going to be able to get it, that's where a lot of this, you're going to need a lot of that push. Because the people who need to get the vaccine, they went out and got it immediately. And the people like me who support the science and also don't want to get sick, we're going out and getting it as well. It's the vaccine skeptics and the hesitant people who need to be persuaded or convinced of it. And I think, in my opinion, the carrot is a lot better than the stick. Giving these incentives from businesses or from anyone else to do this is a really smart idea. And I think the government should encourage that, even if you're not going to do a passport strategy, which again, I think is a lot trickier and a lot more something. I mean, keep in mind, in America, we don't even have a national ID card. We have state ID cards. You use your social security number as a national ID card, which is not what it's designed to be used for, because we don't want that. So that's a very tough sell in a country where we can't even agree to have a national, just a card like that just identifies you. I can't imagine that going over very well.
Yeah. And looking in general at this issue, I would agree with both of you guys on this perspective. I'm a bit hesitant as well, like Eric said, about a complete national ID card. But again, I support vaccination requirements for colleges, public institutions, because ultimately by this fall, ideally, given the amount of vaccines we have now and are going to have, 85% of the country should be vaccinated, 90%. We're only looking, and that's out of eligible participants. So essentially everybody who's old enough to get the vaccine, over 18, will have it. The entire adult population, and that includes people who are young adults as well. And that should be enough to reopen colleges and reopen high schools and to open all other business and public institutions. Now, that said, it's something that we need to work on and we need to encourage it. I'm confident the vaccines are safe, no doubt about it. And I do plan on getting one as soon as I'm able to, probably before I start college. So we're going to have to see this fall how that pans out. But like Nick said, a lot of people the reason they haven't gotten the vaccine yet, it's not because they don't want to get it, it's because they haven't had the opportunity to get it. So I think it's something that's really fascinating to look at. And I think we'll move on to our final topic here, and that is the filibuster, the Senate filibuster. Now, just a little background on the filibuster. And I know you guys are going to have a lot to talk about, so it's worth discussing. But generally, the minority party in the Senate appreciates the filibuster because traditionally, and note I said traditionally, the filibuster allows the minority party to impede voting on a bill via continuous debate, which cannot be ended unless the motion for cloture is attained. And normally in the past, motion for cloture has required 60 votes to be met. So what do you guys think about the filibuster? Democrats obviously don't have enough votes given their narrow Senate majority via Vice President Harris to get rid of the filibuster. Is it worth doing? Because ultimately every party will end up in the minority again, and they might regret their actions while they were in the majority. So do you think that Senators Manchin and Sinema can be persuaded to support getting rid of the filibuster? Do you think Democrats will go through with it? And do you think it's a good idea to get rid of it as a concept? So I'll throw it to Nick first.
Yeah, so I have a few fairly strong opinions on this. I've had numerous rants about this on Twitter, and this isn't an opinion that's based on my political affiliation. This is something that I generally believe, and that is in general that it shouldn't exist. But and I think this is important. I do think it should be. I do think it should be. I think the rules in general, not just in the Senate but in the House as well, should be reformed in order to incentivize compromise more, because that's essentially Republicans' argument right now, is that the filibuster incentivizes compromise. Now, I don't necessarily agree that it incentivizes compromise. I think that it disincentivizes. I think it disincentivizes the general passage of legislation. I've looked at votes. If you look at the votes on any session, regardless of who's in charge of Congress, you'll find that the House vote on way more pieces of legislation. They introduce a lot more. They pass it and hence bring it to the Senate as a result of that. And then the Senate is extremely, extremely unproductive. Last year alone, the Senate didn't propose a single piece of major legislation. It didn't vote on a single piece of major legislation without it being then approved by the House, which I think is a bit crooked in a way, because you can argue as much as you want that the Senate is biased because it's not really properly representative of the people, which I am kind of sympathetic towards. From that liberal perspective, I think the Senate is very biased. I do not think it should be abolished, but I do not think it should have that much influence. I don't think it should be able to strike down a piece of legislation that doesn't have 60 votes, because that essentially gives it an outsized power over the House, and I think the more representative the houses should have more power. Sorry, I went on a bit of a rant there, but
no, that's okay. But I understand your argument to be that we should reform the filibuster. So would you support?
Yeah.
And I know it was pretty common, especially garnered a lot of attention when you look at court nominations that occurred during the Trump administration. But essentially, putting the filibuster limit down to 51 votes for a motion for cloture. Would you support essentially making sure that if there's a filibuster, it always requires 60 votes to attain a motion for cloture?
I think so. I'm not really too familiar with the rules of the Senate and why it's so different in the House. Why there's no like similar structure in the House is you'd have to go like way too deep into the rules of each House. But yeah, I do think in general that lowering it to 51 votes or 50 plus the vice president would be better than the 60 vote threshold that we have now.
And Eric?
I think an interesting point that Nick made, I think, that I want to bring up here before I get into mine is the point of encouraging bipartisanship in the rules. One thing that would be done is the Problem Solvers Caucus. They're a group of bipartisan, I believe it's 23 Republicans and 23 Democrats, some of the more moderate members of both parties, as well as some more conservative and liberal members who like to work with the other side, have proposed in the House going back to regular order, which is where you stop these fast-tracked legislation bills and instead require them to go through multiple committees and get public hearing and votes multiple times in order to get through. That's generally seen as providing more bipartisanship. I know the House in particular is controlled especially by the Speaker and usually operates under more the rule of the majority than it does under the majority in total. So even if you have a majority of members in support of something, unless the majority of members of the governing party are in agreement, that's not going to go anywhere. You could have 220 votes or whatever for gun control, but if the Speaker of the House doesn't want that to go forward, and a majority of the governing party is not in favor, it's not going to happen. Now, for the filibuster, I think it's very important that the filibuster be kept in place, and I'll be very disappointed to see it go. Contrary to the claims of it being some sort of racist institution of Jim Crow, really what it's been used for lately is encouraging bipartisanship and preventing the extremes of both sides from passing through ridiculous legislation on a fast-track basis. We saw this with the stimulus vote. 50 votes was enough to pass through a $1.9 trillion package with a slew of controversial provisions with little or no input from the other side. As a conservative, I'm not in favor of ridiculous legislation. I'm also not in favor of bad legislation and liberal legislation. If the filibuster being around means that I can't get national right to work, I'm okay with that as long as it means that we need to work together on major issues instead of working separately. It really is unfortunate that after years of using the filibuster against Republicans, now Democrats like Chuck Schumer are somehow talking about Republicans as if they're the obstructionist here. When again, the only people using the filibuster the last 6 years are people in the minority, and they used it very frequently and very often, as is their right. They had every right to do that.
And that's the whole point of having a filibuster, and that's exactly why I don't support getting rid of the filibuster. Now, I'll briefly say I 100% support making sure that to get a motion for cloture, you need 60 votes. Not 50, not 51, 60. That's what I support. But I support having a filibuster because it has been used by both parties since its creation. It's integral to the existence of the Senate to have a filibuster.
The nature of the Senate is of this. The difference between the House and the Senate is the House is where the delusional nutcases from both parties go. It's where
the upper chamber. It's supposed to be more reserved, more intelligible in a way. You're supposed
and
to have better debate in the Senate.
yeah, exactly. And right now we're not getting that, and it's really
roughly the Senate's purpose is to check the incompetence of the House before it gets to the president's desk.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, in the Senate, like the worst, absolute worst senators in the Senate right now are probably like Tommy Tuberville and then like Brian Schatz. In the House, they'd be like fairly mediocre House members, but they wouldn't be in the top quartile of batty
someone
people.
Like Marjorie Taylor Greene would not be in the Senate.
Correct. I mean, it's a more prestigious body, and it's one that encourages being able to work together on serious issues rather than, a
lot of that comes from
this showmanship of
harder to be elected to the Senate. I mean, you have to win a statewide primary, not just a district primary. You have to have a statewide coalition that has the appeal to win a primary, and then you have to win a statewide general election campaign. It's a smaller chamber. It's always been more reserved. I mean, remember, when the Senate was created, the intention was for the Senate to not be a chamber in which the members were directly elected by the people. Until the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1914, the Senate was a body composed of members chosen by state legislatures. So another indirect method of election. We see this straining of democracy in a way as being core to the principles of the Republic as it was initially founded. So in a way, the state legislatures acted in a similar manner to the Electoral College in that they prevent the people from directly electing the president, which also fuels the argument. If the House represents the people, you have members that are somewhat crazy on both sides and somewhat centered, and that represents the broad stream of the electorate of the people, many of whom are crazy. And if you look at the Senate, it is a reserved example of straining the people's voice, and the filibuster is necessary to protect that, especially for the minority. So if anything, the Democrats should be watching what they say, because they will inevitably, just like the Republicans are now, be in the minority again. Who knows how long it will be? We may be saying something that isn't accurate, but eventually both parties have their time in the minority, and both of them are guilty of using the filibuster in the past. And I guarantee you, if the tables were turned, the Democrats would not be pushing for the abolition of the filibuster.
Yeah.
It sounds to me as if we agree on, I agree on both Eric and Harrison on most of the issues, apart from the issue of whether the filibuster should be in place or not. I'm actually really glad that you brought up the majority of the majority rule, also known as the Hastert rule, in the House.
Not a great name for that rule at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's an interesting thing. And one thing I want to mention two other things here because I think they're important. The first one is obviously the Senate, even if you got rid of the filibuster, the idea that you'd have automatically 50 votes plus the vice president to do whatever you wanted is a bit much. I mean, 50 votes is a lot, but it's not a majority, and you still need to get everyone from Brian Schatz to Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema on board to do to pass what you wanted. It's not like it's an immediate get everything you want card. The other thing that I think is kind of important to discuss here, is kind of it's just I think it's really unfortunate. One thing I think it's important to mention here is I've heard talk of going back to a talking filibuster, and I think that would be an even worse use of the filibuster than it is right now, if you consider it that way. Because currently, if a bill is filibustered, you can just move on to something else. A talking filibuster takes up all of the day's activity for as many days as the filibuster is running. The Senate goes from not passing much.
Again, we're talking about days.
Nothing. Yeah. Days of filibustering. You think Ted Cruz wouldn't be willing to stand up there on a platform and
for days? Definitely.
Yeah, for a shot at the presidency. Yeah, that's grandstanding at the ultimate level. The current filibuster obviously has flaws, but one thing it does not encourage is grandstanding. Whereas with the talking filibuster, you had the last time it's been used, you had things like Bernie Sanders doing basically promotion for a presidential campaign. You had Ted Cruz reading Dr. Seuss before it was cool for conservatives to read Dr. Seuss. You had all sorts of nonsense happen with these, and you had ultimately this was segregationists, standing up there berating just the basic extension of human rights into people of color. I don't think that's a great thing. I think ultimately what would be a good thing for the country is for Joe Biden and his administration to take a step back and consider what they're talking about right now. When they came in, they talked about unity, they talk about bipartisanship. They've since been saying that bipartisanship doesn't necessarily mean working with Republicans. It just means doing things that poll pretty well with some Republicans in polls. That is a ludicrous definition of bipartisanship. I would go so far as to call it sophistry. It's not bipartisanship. You have a group of 10 Republican senators, probably at any given time, that are willing to bargain their votes for things. Work on infrastructure. Here's something you could do is if you want to do big things, it's easier to do them and to have political cover for them if both sides have involvement. In 2010, the Obamacare debate was going on, 2008, 2009. Barack Obama really wanted Olympia Snowe to vote for Obamacare. He didn't need the vote at that point. I mean, obviously, you had reconciliation. They didn't want to go through that. But if they wanted to go through it without that, they could have just gotten 60 votes, which they would have had before Scott Brown was elected. Mm-hmm. When he talked with her, he talked about how historic it would be if she voted for it. And she was like, yes, but what's in it for me? You're not letting any of my changes in. That they're not. I'll be willing to consider voting for this if you incorporated some things that I like into the bill. And his response was no. That's not a great way to negotiate. And ultimately, it took a bill that could have had some bipartisan cover as a Republican voting for the bill and turned it into one that had no bipartisan cover. It was all Democratic. Every single Democrat was tarred with it and spent their entire campaign defending it. If you want to do big things, you need the other side to buy in because then it can't be used as a weapon against you. That's just my last comment here on why it's important for bipartisanship. You've seen so many of these big bills backfire when things like, to some extent, some New Deal programs, the bill, not the Bush tax cut, but the one that was the Medicaid Part D, Medicare Part D, No Child Left Behind. Those were bipartisan bills, and neither party was pilloried for those. Specifically, even the bailouts, the CARES Act, those are bipartisan. You couldn't go after the other side for it. That's just one last caution I put out there for those who are really wanting to push through a partisan agenda, because it can come back to bite you, and it will bite you.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify my position on this. My position is basically that if a piece of legislation, and I say pieces of legislation rather than a party because I'm fairly against whipping. If a piece of legislation has a majority of votes in the House and a majority of members of the Senate supporting it, it should be able to pass after the necessary processes. I don't like fast tracking, as Eric said. I think that legislation should have a decent amount of debate, a decent amount of hearings, and whatever else. But that includes, if Republicans want to pass a bill in a Democratic majority in Congress. Like, that's why I mentioned the Hastert rule. I'm staunchly against that Hastert rule, and in general, the majority leaders and the speakers of Congress deciding what gets put up to a vote and what doesn't. I think the power should be in the people. If Republicans introduced a bill which had the support of one Democratic senator and 4 Democratic House members, I think it should pass. If Biden's for it, you can talk about the presidential veto as an extra level, but I generally think that is the way to go in terms of bipartisanship. I think bipartisanship for me means every member of Congress, every individual member having a say, and more power put into their hands rather than the hands of leadership positions and people from the majority.
Mm-hmm. And that's definitely an interesting perspective, especially when we're talking about, with the return of earmarks, which have been used traditionally to whip by leadership to whip representatives with tough votes. I actually think that discourages bipartisanship in a way. But getting rid of these more strict party rules would almost certainly not happen.
Yeah.
But if a group like the Problem Solvers Caucus got enough support for a bill, it's hard to imagine it not getting through, I would think. It's just a challenge of getting that support.
Well,
I'm personally a big admirer of the Problem Solvers Caucus. I mean, they get a lot of heat on Twitter, but so they might not like what I say about them. But yeah, I think that they have some fairly good ideas, including some structural reform things. Like they pressured Pelosi in 2019 to do something like that, and it worked.
Mm-hmm. Thank you guys both for coming on for our show today. We hope you guys like the return of the report on all 4 of our discussion issues. And with that, we'll be wrapping up. So thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me.